So recently a new trailer and some footage for the Sonic X Shadow Generations remaster was released, and the more I see of the game, the more I'm liking the direction they're taking the new Shadow campaign. I noticed a bunch of people were, and still are, a little skeptical, saying that the level design they showed looked a little too linear, which got me thinking, aren't a lot of 3D Sonic stages linear? What about linear Sonic levels is inherently a bad thing? I think a lot of those fears are a side effects of the most recent Boost games, Forces and Cyberspace and Frontiers, having stages that aren't super engaging, and left a lot to be desired for most people, including myself. But Sonic levels have been pretty linear for over 2 decades at this point, and by taking a step back and looking at the broader picture, I think it's easier to see why this linear works, and why this linear doesn't. Sonic Adventure 2 was the first game to take this linear approach we're familiar with today. A lot of stages are pretty flat, with little in the way of optional pathways to take depending on the stage. But just because these level layouts are technically simpler than the original Sonic Adventure, that doesn't mean there's nothing going on in them. This simplicity is by design, and is supplemented by the new focus on the ranking system. Starting with Sonic Adventure 2, a secondary goal was added on top of just getting to the goal: score as many points as possible, from collecting rings, defeating enemies in a quick chain, performing tricks off rails. Just about everything you do on the way to the goal ring adds to your point total. You lose your whole score total whenever you die, so you're incentivized to play well to both avoid dying and accumulate a bunch of points. The stages are built in such a way where you can seamlessly chain together points through a variety of methods, and most stages have some unique way of acquiring points, like the trick ramps in City Escape, the light dash trails in Higher Rocket Handle and Metal Harbor, those trick rings in Pyramid Cave, to the abundance of rails you can trick off of in Final Rush. This philosophy even extends to the other gameplay styles, like the mech stages. Since you can't move as fast as you can in the speed stages, you're incentivized to defeat large chains of enemies in a row to get a higher score bonus to compensate. The game rewards you with mastery of a stage by giving you more and more opportunities to rack up points as you become more familiar with the layouts and the enemy placements. Even the treasure hunting stages reward you for stage mastery by providing score bonuses for how fast you can find an emerald shard and with as few hints as possible. The ranking system seamlessly ties together all of the game's mechanics while motivating you to fully interact with the stage. And thanks to the more linear stage design, it's easier to tell what you can and can't interact with and what will get you points, rewarding you for mastering a stage and not dying. It makes nailing a stage and getting that A rank all the more satisfying. Ah shit. Sonic Heroes takes a similar approach with its stages, but it goes in a slightly different direction. Its stages are bigger with more branching pathways, and instead of having a bunch of actions you can chain together with points, the focus is more centered around defeating enemies and beating the stage without dying. There's still plenty of things that will give you points, like the rainbow trick rings for example, but there's less of a focus on unique actions like an SA2. The game is still able to keep things interesting through the team system. You have access to 3 different characters at any given time, each of which have different attributes and shortcuts available to them, so you're constantly switching between the 3 to keep the flow of the stage going and find the best routes. It keeps you on your toes as you run through each team's campaign, each of which have longer or shorter levels depending on the team. The stages in Shadow the Hedgehog are designed in a similar way to those in Heroes. Instead of having multiple characters though, you instead have multiple objectives you can tackle depending on the stage. For example, you could be tasked with something basic like finding a Chaos Emerald, or something more involved like defeating a certain number of enemies, or finding a group of items. The objective you complete determines what level you go to once you complete it, and depending on the stage they can completely change how you interact with them. Some even have unique areas you only go to while trying to complete that mission. That can either be a good thing or a bad thing depending on the stage and the objective, since some of them can be really annoying, but it does make navigating the game a lot more interesting in my opinion. Depending on your routing, you can completely skip stages if you don't want to do them, which adds a neat layer of decision making to what stages and objectives you decide to complete while going after a specific ending, even if the game can suck balls. The Boost games are where things get interesting in my opinion, since they're all designed in a very similar way. These stages still have that focus on fast-paced platforming, but there's also a greater emphasis on spectacle, both in the level design and the set pieces. A lot of times these sections still serve a purpose, whether that's showcasing Sonic's blistering speeds, the beautifully detailed environments, or just giving the player a small break from the action to gather themselves. Because of how much faster these stages tend to be, it's important to give the player a small break every now and then to catch their breath, so that they aren't going full blast for the entire stage and risk being overwhelmed. There's a greater emphasis on staying on the fastest path while beating enemies and collecting rings to get the best time, since those factors are what usually allow you to maintain your boost gauge and contribute to your end of stage ranking. Despite being pretty linear in their design, these stages have a lot of split-second decision making that can either make or break your run, especially if you're trying to go for a higher ranking, which makes them more engaging as a result. I think Unleashed benefits the most from this design philosophy, since it has the longest stages in the series, and the higher rankings are pretty difficult to nav even as an experienced player. But that doesn't mean that colors and generations don't have their own strengths. The wisps and colors, for example, add different ways to interact with the stage, whether that be access to an optional route, or just skipping chunks of levels altogether, and you need to use them effectively if you want to get the S ranks. While Generations has a simpler ranking system, it makes up for that with tight, memorable level design, and it feeds into that time trial appeal by showing how much you're over or under your best time whenever you hit a checkpoint. What all of these games have in common is that they have mechanics intertwined with tight level design to keep you occupied while traversing their linear stages. And mechanics like the ranking system motivate the player to fully interact with the game's systems to get the most out of each level. Each game offers both an intrinsic motivation for strong play, through its differing paths to help you beat the level faster or with flashy set pieces, while also offering an extrinsic motivation through various hidden items and a score ranking for each stage. SA2 has a variety of action chains you can perform to accumulate a high score. Heroes has the different character types to make the level design and combat a little bit more nuanced, and the boost games have split-second decision making and spectacle to keep you entertained both visually and in the gameplay while blasting through them at high speed. This isn't even taking into account all the various items scattered across the games to make playing them over and over again more enticing, whether that be the basic item boxes with rings and shields, the animals for the Chow Garden, special stage keys, sun and moon medals, or even the red rings in later games. All of these mechanics work together to keep you both entertained and engaged while blasting through the stages, while also offering an incentive to go back and further master the stage, which is where I think games like Forces and Frontiers falter. The biggest issue with the stages in both Forces and Frontiers is that they don't commit to anything in a substantial way, and as a result the stages aren't nearly as engaging as they could be. Take Forces for example. Despite there being like 30 levels in the game, they all take on average 1 minute to complete, and during that minute you aren't doing anything to keep yourself engaged. There's a lot of stages where you just run straight forward with no resistance for a majority of the runtime. While there are moments like this scattered throughout the older games, they're often short and aren't a large percentage of the stage like they are in Forces. A lot of the cool moments are relegated to QuickTime events, and you don't even need to complete them to progress in the stage. But even then, those are often sidetracked, in favor of strings of dash pads or homing attack chains. Any cool ideas these stages could explore are squandered because the stages end before they can really get going. While this game does have a ranking system, you can get an S rank just by breathing, so it feels very superfluous. Like take Stage 8, Luminous Forest for example. You can beat this stage in its entirety by just holding forward and occasionally jumping. Not even adjusting your trajectory or anything, just jumping and holding forward. And that still nets you an S rank. About 75% of this minute-and-a-half stage is just a flat hallway with boost pads that launch you in the right direction. And while this is probably the most extreme example of this in the game, other stages are also riddled with issues like this. The red rings in this game don't feel as satisfying either because they're often plopped in the middle of the beaten path. The game does offer 2 other sets of collectibles, but because these stages are so short, you end up collecting them in the same areas anyway, so they feel, again, superfluous. The game offers very little and engaging mechanics. The closest we get are the avatar weapons, but even then the first one is so powerful there's very little reason to swap it out and experiment with the others. So because there's nothing to keep you engaged, the game is very boring, and drags like hell despite being only 3 hours long. Cyberspace and Frontiers has a similar issue. You'd think being based off previous level design, the stages would meet a baseline level of quality, but unfortunately that's not the case. A part of the reason is the stages themselves are still pretty small. They cut a bunch of pre-existing stages into multiple smaller ones. For example, Green Hill Act 2 from Generations is split into its 3D and 2D portions. This means a lot of the levels run into the issues that Forces does, where levels end before they can really get going, because you are actually only playing half a stage, less than that in some cases. This feeling is made worse by the way Sonic controls in cyberspace. For some reason, he's slower than in any of the games cyberspace pulls from. Hell, he's slower than the run speed in the open zone areas of the same game. On top of that, a lot of these stages blend together because they're missing the aesthetics they originally had in favor of 5 preset ones. And in a lot of cases, they're also missing mechanics that made the stages more engaging in the first place. For example, you can't even boost through enemies in this game, which, while not a horrible change on paper, constantly gets in the way since a lot of these stages are made with that feature in mind. And even if you did remember to jump and attack enemies manually, there's an insane rebound on the homing attack that makes it slow and tedious. Eventually, you start to just skip past everything and run through the stage on its own, which isn't any fun because the ranking system was changed to be time-based, coupled with extremely lenient S-rank times. Basically, cyberspace fails because it has no agency. While yes, you can get some enjoyment by going through them like the game wants you to, because there's nothing pushing you to actually try and interact with the game's systems, it's easy to become complacent, to become bored. You can get the same experience interacting with the stage normally as you would just by taking a brisk jog through them, which isn't the case with the older games. So in short, what separates the good linear Sonic levels from the bad ones? The good stages tend to motivate the player to perform well, whether through spectacle or making you work for a high ranking, which drives the player to interact with the stage to its fullest, while offering a reason to come back to them over and over again. Meanwhile, the lesser ones don't do anything to test or motivate the player, and thus they don't have a lasting impact or drive to master the stage. Giving the player a reason to master your stage is a good way to get them to both interact with it fully and remember it after they're done playing, and it's why both Forces and Cyberspace leave a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. There's little to no incentive to play these stages more than once, because they don't do anything to motivate the player to come back and attempt to master them, whether it's through their short length, lackluster ranking systems, clunky physics, or a combination of the three. With all that being said, the question remains if Shadow Generations is doing enough to motivate the player, and at the time of writing, I think it has a lot of potential. The amount of footage we have at the moment is limited to just one stage in a boss fight, but from what's been shown, I'm pretty optimistic. For starters, the first stage clocks in around 5 to 6 minutes, which is way longer than a Forces or Cyberspace level, which has me excited. We haven't had long levels like this since arguably Unleashed, and that's one of my favorite things from that game, so I'm excited to see it return. Another thing I really like so far are Shadow's Chaos powers. From what's been shown, they seem to have a lot of utility. Chaos Control, for example, can slow down time and stop the timer, but it can also be used to stop stage hazards like missiles that can then be used as platforms to reach different areas. I think this has a lot of potential, not only as a means of reaching shortcuts, but also for timer management as well. The ranking system seems to be time-based again, so I think it could be really interesting if you had to stagger your use of Chaos Control to keep a low time, but also keep enough available to take any shortcuts tied to it. It has the potential to make the S ranks really interesting again, which is something I think the series has been missing for a while. There seems to be a variety of different paths and shortcuts to take advantage of. While I'm a little nervous about how much downtime there is in places, especially in the Radical Highway section of this level, I also understand that this is the first stage in the game, and the purpose of the highway section seems to be story related, so I guess we'll see how it turns out. While I am really sick of the bringing back past levels trope, I'm willing to look past it this time, since it's attached to what was already a celebration of the series' history. Plus, they're pulling from stuff they don't normally pull from, so it feels somewhat fresh. I'm really happy they're starting to acknowledge the black sheep parts of the franchise again. Like, if this was 10 years ago, there's no way we'd be getting a Shadow-centric campaign that references both his game and 06, while also getting new cool stuff like the Doom Wings or whatever they're actually called. But so far, I like a lot of what we see, and while I have my nitpicks, I'm willing to hold my judgment until I can play the game for myself. So all of this to say, I don't think the levels in Shadow Generations being more linear is inherently a bad thing. Linear Sonic stages are more than capable of being fun and engaging, and there's almost 2 decades of games that are able to prove that point. I think Shadow Generations has a lot of potential, and I can't wait to see what Papa Sega is cooking for us come October.